Evolutionary.org Hardcore 2.0 coming your way, episode 83. We've got an exciting one coming your way on this one. We're going to talk about injectable Primobolan versus oral Primobolan, complements of EuroPharma. So this is going to be a really good one. We're going to go over Primobolan history and facts. We're going to touch on oral Primobolan info, talk about the female use. Some females like to use it, and give you the facts on oral Primobolan. We're going to talk about the different Primo options that EuroPharmacies has to offer. And then we're going to talk about how best to utilize Primo for best results, give you some stacking ideas, tell you how to dose it so you have an idea of how much you need to order. And then we're going to talk about why EuroPharmacies is so damn popular. Very, very important. We understand that Primobolan is one of those that is very essential that you're using a good source for. So we're going to touch on that as well. So let's talk about Primobolan, give you a little of the history for those of you history buffs out there. Chemical name, methanolone. By far most popular injectable anabolic steroid for cutting cycles. Really, probably in the history of bodybuilding, since bodybuilders really started to get into steroid use. And look, and I'll bring him Mobster because he could touch a little bit more of the history in the 70s since he lived it. He lived those days. Arnold, we know that Arnold, that was his favorite steroid. And the reason they loved Primo was because Primo did what they were looking for. Primo didn't have the side effects. Primo didn't give them the water retention. The reason is a DHT derivative. And the way it's structured was they took the DHT hormone and they made it into Primobolan. And they structured it in a way where, in bodybuilding terms, you can use it, get good, clean, slow muscle mass growth over time, low side effects, very little androgenic issues, very little estrogenic issues. So guys in the 70s absolutely loved it for that reason. It didn't give them gyno when they were using, they'd ramp up the dose. Supposedly Arnold was running 100 milligrams a day of this stuff, so 700 milligrams a week. And they really did well on it. And that was why, one of the reasons why it's called the golden age of bodybuilding isn't just because of, the way guys looked and the way they kind of tanned themselves and made themselves go on stage and all that stuff, but also Primobolan played a big role in the golden age during the 70s. So Mobster, why don't you touch on the 70s a little bit? Because you lived it. You were there in the 70s. What, you were in college during the 70s, huh?
No, I would have been in primary school. I would have been in the 70s. I think what 1980, I was 15, so I would have been like, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of age in the 70s. But I was around in the 70s. I remember the heat waves, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so brief history of steroids, and we've actually done a show specifically on this, as Steve knows, was we've seen very early use. People think it's like a 70s thing. No, 60s thing. No, try 1930s, guys, in terms of actual steroid use. I've literally, and we did this for the show, came across several adverts, I think 3, 4 adverts, which we found for the show. And we actually included one in the visuals that we attached to the promo for the show of a 1932 or 1937 advert for a form of steroid. In fact, pre that, they're talking about hormonal tablets, which we probably just offal, dried, ground up, and turned into a pill. But just after that, Steve, there was adverts for, as you know, what was very, very early steroids. And the problem was, of course, that these were like super, super short lives. There was no esters and all that kind of stuff. And so you would have had to, realistically, and they didn't know that at the time, you'd have had to have taken it multiple times per day. Now we fast forward through the 60s when we talked about Debo and we talked about how that's come into the country, Ziegler, York Barbell's role, the lifters at York, and so on and so forth. And of course, that expands out into the rest of the weightlifters in America and naturally the bodybuilders, and then of course around the world. So let's get to the 70s. When we got to the 70s, it was slightly different, but it wasn't crazy different. It's certainly not what we've had now. So what happened in the 70s, and by rumor, by reputation, and I've even mentioned on a previous show that I actually spoke to someone who was a buddy of, briefly or otherwise, of Arnold in California, and I'm not even sure this fella's still alive, but Dr. Leo Rosa sitting in an open-top convertible with Arnold, with a couple of other guys, cruising around, saying hi to the girls and having a fun time. And so some of the conversations you hear online regarding what Arnold was using came from people trying to figure out what they thought he was using. Some of it would be, how is Arnold better than me? So he must be using more drugs than me. And then, of course, you've actually got word of mouth use. The other issue, so that's in terms of, how did we come up with these numbers? Why do we think Arnold was using this? Why do we think Arnold was using that? Part of that comes from, we know what was available. And it was a lot less than the guys have access to today. A lot less. So, for example, we know, and I'm talking about Randy Roach's Muscle Smoke and Mirrors, which refers to some of the guys, including Arnold, and Arnold talks about having it when it was legal and on prescription on chat shows in the late 70s and early 80s. And so they were able to go to a doctor that was recommended, a fan of bodybuilding, down the street, so to speak, and get prescription steroids given to them. And they had a very early sort of way of monitoring the bodybuilders, if they were getting bad acne, if they got something that looked like gyno, whatever else. Now, all of this information wasn't fully known, wasn't completely understood. That came from conversations, in response to drugs. And obviously later on, we started to see articles on this subject appearing late 70s, early 80s in the magazines and so on and so forth. But it meant that they could have a doctor inject them how many times per week, whatever. It meant that they could have prescription medication rather than stuff out of the trunk, which did happen in those days, posted across from the East Coast to the West Coast and vice versa, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that Steve and I have talked about is literally, for example, the non-existence or unavailability of AIs. We've talked about the limited access to pretty much most forms of actual testosterone, whether that's cypionate, propionate, and so on and so forth. So, and again, so this is a question of what was available from the labs, what was available via doctor, the lack of knowledge, and so on and so forth. So we go, why did guys like Arnold use Primo? Why did guys like Arnold use D-Bol? Was there access to other things? Yes, but in a very limited way. And most Joes at the gym would be completely unaware of how to get hold of these products. They wouldn't have necessarily access to a friendly doctor and so on. So the two most common spoke about, which we've done shows on before, which we're doing a show on now, would be Dianabol, kind of obvious, as a bulker, and Primobolan. And we go, why Primobolan? Right, so Steve mentioned the history saying super popular, and probably still super popular as a cutting stack steroid. Now, if we're talking about Arnold and the rest of the guys, they're going to bulk up, and it was very popular to get seriously big in the off season. And then come competition time, naturally get rid of that fat, get into shape, get stage ready. And one of the things that came with that is that you do not want to add pounds of muscle in the off season, then cut and lose half, as we say, your gains going into a competition. You want to retain as much muscle tissue as you've added, as much as you possibly can. It's natural to lose a little. But I would hate Steve to gain 10 pounds of muscle in the off season and then only keep 3 pounds. That would fuck my mind. And even in the 70s, with the lack of products available. So Primo had this great, and still has this great reputation. It's not what we would call a muscle builder per se. You're not going to bulk up on Primo. You're not going to add 10, 15, 20 pounds like you might do on D-Bol or Anadrol. What you might do maybe is a little bit like Anavar. You might gain 2, 3 pounds. You might even bulk on cycle 4 or 5 pounds, but you're only realistically going to keep a couple of pounds. Now, 2 things. If you are competing, if you are cutting down, retention of that hardened muscle tissue is perfect, which is what Primo is absolutely amazing for. And I think the other aspect, Steve, is like I said with the Anavar and so on and so forth. Cutting, keeping muscle tissue, being strong. But what's the key phrase that I've heard used is quality. If you gained any muscle on Primobolan, quote unquote, a weak steroid, the gains were quality, the gains were keepable. So even if you used it as a steroid to gain muscle, what you did gain was amazing. And then again, if you're cutting down, if you're getting lean, if you're doing a modeling gig, if you're getting ready for the beach, or specifically like Arnold and the guys back in the day, golden age, you were holding on to as much of that gained muscle tissue as you had in the off season. And that's what you want. You don't want to go on with that stringy bean look. You don't want to lose muscle. What's the point of gaining all that size in the off season, and so on and so forth? So there's your history. Again, you have to think, guys, when we look at that kind of stuff, well, we've got other options. We have other things that we can do. They didn't have that. I think, Steve, that you hear some of the stories. I think you was limited to like 4, maybe 5 steroids. And even then, was you getting what was legit? I don't, arguably, back in the day, yes, because there wasn't many people faking it. So there's lots of bits and pieces. And again, it's one of those things where people argue about Arnold if he competed now, or Ronnie if he was still competing, would things be different? And so on and so forth. And the obvious answer is yes. I think Arnold was so goddamn competitive, arguably the most psych-out kind of guy, the most hungry to win, etc., etc. The idea that Arnold now, as he has said now, probably wouldn't do that crazy kind of shit. I say no. Arnold was so fucking driven. He would be using Tren back in the day if Tren had been available. He would be using the other kinds of testosterones. But this was a question of what was available. I think the rumor stuff will come down to, as you said, the rumors were that Arnold was using 100 milligrams if everybody else was using 50. And I suspect it's a combination of, yes, I can see Arnold being super hungry, driven to want to beat the others by maybe using a little bit more steroid. But equally, I suspect it's one of those, same as we see now, Steve. The only reason that person's a pro, the only reason they're bigger than me is because they're using more steroids. And sometimes that's just not true. So the idea, I think one of the rumors and stories I heard was he would grab a handful of Dynamo pills and throw them down his neck. And I think the reality was he was probably using no more or less than anybody else. It's just guys can't work out why Arnold's a better bodybuilder. So maybe he was driven to use more, maybe, but equally it's people trying to figure out why he's a better athlete. He's winning more shows than they are, and it can only be because he's using more drugs. That's not always true. So what do you think on the history stuff, Steve, before we move on?
Yeah, and then, as we got into the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s, as physique started getting bigger and bigger, as the American physique started getting bigger, we started eating a lot more food. We started eating, 6, 7, 8 meals a day. And, it's not a lot of snacking and stuff like that. So listen, lifters and bodybuilders definitely have gotten bigger across the board. So I think what started happening is guys, instead of using something to kind of get bigger and recomp going into a competition, they started using things to cut down going into a competition. And a lot of them were still using Primo, but what they would do is they ramp up the dose really high, and then they cut their calories going into their contest. So today we see guys who want to use Primo. They're people who want low side effects. They're physique competitors. They're those who want to run something mild to get good, clean, lean muscle mass. It's not something that you're going to take and blow up in 4 weeks or 5 weeks. If that's what you want, go to EuroPharmacy's website, pick something else. There's lots of different options for that. It's for people who don't mind taking their time. It's not something you're going to see results in 4 or 5 weeks. You're going to have to give it the full cycle of 12 weeks or 10 weeks or 14 weeks, however long you decide to use it. We'll talk about later in the show different ways to use it, but you got to give it time to really start kicking in. It's not going to be something that's going to be noticeable. And the injectable version comes in an NFA ester, so it's going to take some time. NFA ester, you got to give it a solid 3-4 weeks to even reach peak in your system, probably closer to 4 or 5 weeks to reach peak in your system. So it's one of those steroids. It's not for someone who's impatient. It's not for someone who wants to move the scale up. It's not for someone who wants crazy strength. You know what I'm saying? So it's just not what it's for, but it has a purpose. And a lot of people today, Mobster, we're seeing some people logging it and they're very impressed with the results. They're like, wow, this stuff is amazing. And it's doing a lot more than I thought it would, because it's one of those steroids. If you got your diet and your training on point, and you go and you bust your ass in the gym and you eat the right way and you do your cardio and you do all the things you're supposed to do, it can really give you a nice physique.
Let me touch on two things there, Steve. One, it occurs to me as you were talking is that those athletes, those users that are already kind of lean, and I'm talking about 12% and down, are and don't want to get much out of shape. So if you're kind of lean, skinny, but you're muscular, you've got abs, we can see the shape of your delts, etc., etc. You're not necessarily 250, 300 pounds, but you're, 170, 180, 190, and you're only interested in quality gains. Primo would absolutely appeal to them. As Steve says, me as a strength athlete, me as a guy that wants to be the size of a house, lifting crazy fucking weights, I can't see that necessarily I'd want to use Primo, but I can certainly see me if I ever decided to get in shape, being absolutely, looking over in Primo's direction for sure. Something else that occurs to me, and I think we touched on it in another show, Steve, is the idea of open class versus classic versus physique. And I said, again, if there's a weight restriction, which there is, I believe, in the classic and physique classes, open class doesn't tend to have that. If you compete specifically, as some federations still do, have actual weight categories, 90 kilo lifters, athletes, 100 kilo athletes, and so on and so forth. You can't weigh more than 200 pounds, you can't weigh more than 220 pounds. Then the idea of making sure that the pounds that you do have of muscle are quality is where I could see that being used. So, for example, if it was a toss up between does open class athletes, that's the pro Mr. Olympia class, the top class, whatever you want to call it, big primo users, I would say no. I absolutely would say yes to classic and yes to physique class athletes using it for those reasons. Because again, I mean, literally, you can see this. C-Bum, Attel, his class, they get weighed. We've seen arguments about the hairstyles and all the rest of it, people trying to make height and all that kind of stuff, and having to go away and pee and come back to make sure that they're the weight. So if you can't be above a certain body weight unless you get fucking taller since the last competition, then you absolutely want every single pound of muscle on your body to be quality. So I can way more see, certainly say as an argument, way more likely to see that those class athletes would be, you'd probably more likely to see Primo as part of their makeup. Let's move on a little tiny bit here, Steve. And it's something that you and I discussed in the pre-show and after the last show that we recorded. And that was the idea of, and Steve and I actually agreed on this, we need to include a little bit more information in this regard, which is the idea of women using Primobolan. And we say, why? And also one more thing, which just occurs to me, Steve, and I'm going to make a note while we're talking, and that is was Primo, and I'll let Steve jump in just for a second here, talk about Primo being fake, Steve, and why that was an issue back in the day. And we'll expand again on quality product at the end of the show, but talk about why Primo was a problem for some athletes because it was so commonly fake before.
Yeah, so before we get into oral Primobolan use and female use, and then we'll get into different Primo options from EuroPharma and how to stack it. A couple more points that I should add. So one of the reasons why Primo have fell out of favor, I think, during the 2000s and 2010s, and even going into today, it's not listed as a top 10 popular steroid according to polls and according to sources that sell it. And I think a big reason for that, it's not that I think, it's that I know, is that Primo is very expensive and very faked. And that's a big problem. So when that happens, a lot of people are going to be skittish to use it. So what started happening is people would instead of giving people Primo, they'd give people Deca, or they'd give people Masteron, or give people another steroid, a cheaper steroid, and then put the label as Primo just to kind of rip off their customers. So that became a big problem. And I can remember 15 or 20 years ago, it was almost impossible to find legitimate Primo out there. So basically people just gave up on it. So I think a big part of why Primo is kind of making a comeback today is because now we have sources and brands like EuroPharmacies that are providing actual Primo that's been tested and verified as being Primo and 99% quality, 98% quality. So this is a big reason for the comeback. And then one more thing, Mobster, I know you want to touch on it too. I just want to add this just in case you're wondering. There's still a couple countries today that actually market Primobolan for medical use, and that is Japan and Moldova. So that is just important to know. So it's still, believe it or not, today, even though It's a controlled substance in most of the world, and it was introduced for medical use in 1961. There are still a couple countries that actually use it for medical use. So I thought that was interesting just to include. Mobster touched on that a bit, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Yeah. So look, guys, how often, for example, let's just deal with the idea that fakes still exist, which they do, because we have still got access to the videos of people making steroids in lockups, in kitchens, in warehouses that don't look anything like a laboratory, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we occasionally see when we're discussing steroids on the forums is people that are still keen, or that's a much, much smaller group than it ever used to be, of what we call home brewing. So essentially buying raw powders in from, say, Japan or China or wherever they're getting their raw powders from, and bringing them in and then home producing for themselves and occasionally for buddies, etc. Home brewed steroids. Now, sometimes is a quality product, but for the most part, it's literally what it sounds like, what it is. And again, I've seen videos. I think there's a video on YouTube of a guy with a load of what appears to be nice sterile polythene lying in his kitchen cabinets, etc., etc. And there he is. As we've even, I think, one video have them making it in the sink. I've talked about other videos where we've seen the same kitchen on Lad Bible of all places, Steve, and he's making it, and there's no polythene. I'm not even. I think he's wearing gloves. I don't think he's wearing a mask, and he's making it for the local market where he lives, and so on. What you never see, and I certainly have never seen, is anybody that's home brewing Primobolan. So just to give you an example, again, like Steve said, the idea, if you're going to do that, and there's probably no profit for those guys to do it that particular way, you need to be a proper pharmaceutical company that does it on an industrial scale and therefore is able to make sure that the product, I mean, Steve, are those guys testing the raw powders when they come to the country? Very rarely. Yeah, but labs like EuroPharma is 100%. If I'm buying kilograms of the raw powder, I want to make sure the raw powder is exactly what it is. The profit margin is probably small. As Steve said, it's not a massive seller on any of the companies that we discuss on these shows. So again, you want to make sure that you, and we will touch on this, you go, the raws are being tested, it's being done in a lab, it's being produced in a particular way. And yes, relative to, say, for example, cypionate or enanthate of testosterone, it's going to be that little bit more expensive. But again, why are we seeing more people using it? We're seeing more people using it because not everybody wants to be 300 pounds. Not everybody wants to 250 pounds. Some guys just want to look good for the clubs. Some guys just love having a six pack all the time. And for them, I would argue, Steve, certainly your general user, you're not competing user, the argument is definitely to be made for quality gains and a quality looking appearance. That's what they want. They don't want a 400-pound bench, Steve. They want to look amazing with a 250-pound bench. They want to wear one of those tight type outfits, and that is a huge percentage of the market. It's almost ignored by people like myself, but it is a massive percentage of the market. People do the crazy shit like I do, small. People that do the hot yoga and stuff like Steve does is small. People would just want to look good for the club, massive percentage of the market, and Primobolan would absolutely appeal to them for that reason. Touching upon the women's stuff, Steve, and I made a couple of notes here, right? So when we discuss female use of testosterone, or should I say more accurately, performance-enhancing drugs, there's a little bit of history in regards to female physique-type competitors, which might push the envelope in terms of testosterone use. But for the most part, bearing in mind what I've just said in regards to primo use for men, and the majority in the market being the guys who want to stay lean and in shape, the same thing applies to women. Not very few women want to get huge. Very few women want to be especially muscular and strong. And then, of course, without going into too much detail, you've got the terrible issues of if you copy a male athlete's steroid stack, performance enhancing drug use, the issues, the side effects that can spring up are horrendous. Now, I don't care how kind of psycho crazy I want to look like a freak you are as a male bodybuilder, never mind a female athlete. There are always going to be the risk versus rewards. And the problem is worse when it comes to women in terms of copying male dosages and using male PEDs. So there's really a very small limited bit. And I'll let Steve expand on this briefly. But I pretty much would recommend the following. Right? So I literally only heard about this the other day. something called Femtest, which is a super low testosterone product specifically produced to treat women with medical conditions, but it's used by female bodybuilders. Low dose Primobolan, which we're going to talk about, and again, low dose Anavar. So, for example, Steve, 2.5 milligrams to 5 milligrams a day of Anavar versus, for example, in my case, anywhere between 30 to 50 milligrams. And I've said on multiple shows, 50 milligrams per day is a sweet spot. Occasionally, I've seen people go higher, but I would never, ever recommend that for women. Talk about the side effects that some women could have if they copied men's PED type stack, Steve, in terms of virilization and so on.
Yeah, so because primobolan is a DHT derivative, you can expect some DHT side effects. So, really, when it comes to primobolan, it's on the list for women, but it's not like high on the list. So, I'd rather women use other steroids. But what women do is they'll use the oral primo version because the oral primo version is much weaker than the injectable primo version. So, let's talk about the oral primo version so you understand exactly where it comes from. So when it comes to the oral primo, um, it's going to be acetate. So it's either called the primo acetate or it's called the the technical term when it comes to it, which is the methanolone acetate, and it's a oral one methylated version. And I've seen a couple things showing that it's not liver toxic, but you got to keep in mind any oral that you put in your body is going to have some effects on your liver. So,
Yeah.
although it may not be specifically oral toxic compared to other steroids, there's a chance that it's going to. So, I was actually on the pre-show looking at a couple different basically things. So I found on the pharmacology of anabolic steroids, which is the British Journal of Pharmacology, they were saying it was not liver toxic. Also, William Llewellyn's Anabolics, Molecular Nutrition, says it's not liver toxic. But I've seen other things that say it is. So I think there's a lot of confusion on that. But it goes back to what I said before. Even if an oral steroid isn't specifically going to be liver toxic, it can still affect the liver. So keep that in mind. So yeah, it's going to be less liver toxic than most oral steroids, but it can have some effects. The bottom line is it's very, very weak. So if you're going to run the oral primo as a man, you're wasting your time, in my opinion. I'm going to explain why. So as a man, you're going to have to run 100 to 150 milligrams a day. And really the lowest dose I've seen a man run is like 75 milligrams a day. So if you actually do the math, it's getting really, really expensive for something that's going to be way less effective as the injectable primo. So as a man, I would not even bother with oral primo. But as a woman, being weaker and having less effects may come to your advantage. So some women will run maybe 25 milligrams of oral primobolan or a little less or a little more, depending on where you're at in your journey. And you can actually get some of the benefits of primo with way less of the side effects that you would with the injectable primo. So long story short, really, I would say as a man, don't waste your time, as I said, but as a woman, maybe it has some advantages, but I still think it's going to be not as good as using just Anavar or some other of the steroids that are out there. Go ahead, Monster.
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me, Steve, and I'm just referring to the scientific data talking about not being liver toxic. I would actually argue against that. Any oral preparation of any oral medication, I'm including over-the-counter painkillers and anti-inflammatories and the like, has to be something that's going to pass through the stomach acid, has to be something that's going to pass through the liver, and so on and so forth. So I suspect it's very much dose related. It may well be that Bill Llewellyn and others are looking at the medical use, regards to the original medical data that you refer to, and then Bill Llewellyn thinking, no one's going to be using crazy amounts. And unfortunately, what we have seen in some female competitors is that the numbers start to creep up in terms of their use versus, where they perhaps started from. So a low dose might be perfectly fine, but you go 40, 50 milligrams a day and suddenly you start to see issues that weren't there before. Bill might be looking at, 10 milligrams a day or 20 milligrams a dose, because that was what was common when he wrote those books. That's an example. And the other thing which occurred to me, Stephen, I made a little note as you were talking, goes, what else are they doing? And the reality is thus. I don't think there's any serious athlete, never mind competing athletes, male or female, that's almost, especially if they're going on to stages, it's using one drug. So, for example, Clen or insulin or growth hormone or whatever else. I can't think of, you and I, we've done multiple shows on, and we occasionally mention other kinds of athletes, never mind bodybuilders, sometimes weightlifters, strongmen, actual athletes that are, athletics, and so on and so forth. And the idea that any of those athletes, any of those individuals, and specifically female competing bodybuilders, female physique competing, the figure physique, everything, the idea that they're using one single drug is laughable. So the idea, you go, yes, if you only use Primobolan, there might be an argument to be made for, toxicity from single low dose, blah, 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 blah. Yes, but very few are just using one drug. Very few are just using one PED to get on stage and look amazing. So the idea that you then need to look at other things. What else are they doing? What other stressors are there? And then, of course, is literally the idea of getting into absolutely crazy shape and looking like an absolute freak. And I don't care what class you're doing, the lower the body weight, the more extreme the diet, the harder the training, the higher the risk factors. And so, for example, a dehydrated, underweight, using some sort of form of testosterone, etc., 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 is going to push the risk factors higher for potential issues and so on and so forth. Arguably, it doesn't just apply to women, it applies to men as well. You're pushing the envelope in order to look absolutely fucking crazy, being dehydrated, being very low body fat, etc., etc., and then say there's no risk factors for liver toxicity is laughable. So, it's not healthy. It's amazing. It looks fantastic. Being strong is fucking great. But there's the risk factors, in my case, just the risk factors for injury, Steve, when I was breaking records. If I'm doing something no fucker's done before, there's a chance I might tear a muscle or, strain a tendon or whatever. Of course, much higher for me. If I'm doing that when I'm super lean, like an athlete that's competing on stage as a bodybuilder, then the risk factors are incredibly high. If I'm doing that dehydrated or hungry or whatever, risk factors are higher. So I would take it that those numbers might be true, but I would treat it as though they were definitely the case that there was a risk for toxicity. And again, most studies, everything that kind of supports these kind of things, are very, very rarely done with PED use type dosages and so on and so forth. So that, again, doesn't make any sense to me. Do you want to move on, Steve, now onto the actual options that are available? Was there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I'll put it, again, I'll say, if you consider the cost, if you consider the pain, having to remember to take a pill every day and not remembering if you took it or whatnot. I mean, obviously for a man, it makes more sense just to go with the injectable version. So let's get into the injectable versions that we have from EuroPharma. So the different Primo options as follows. Do you want to read them off, Mobster, or do you want me to?
No, I read them off.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I did all the research. So here, guys, we're going to EuroPharmacy options and bring these numbers to you. And this is direct and through via a couple of their biggest resellers. So Primo Depot or Primobolan Depot, they have a 75 milligram per mil option in the new and expanded range of their 15 mil vials. They have a Primo Depot as a 100 milligram option, and that's in their older, more traditional, but still available 10 mil vials. And obviously, you might want the higher dose option. You might want a 15 mil option. So it's entirely up to you. And then the Primobolan, but specifically as the methanolone acetate, and that's the name rather than Primo in this particular example, Steve. And that's 50 milligrams per mil in the 10 milligram option. And as Steve said earlier on, you might be able to use that one orally because it's the acetate version. And then again, and it's the name rather than the actual product, Steve. The methanolone enanthate, 100 milligram, that's per milliliter, and that is in a 10 mil version. So those are the 4 options that are available to you for you to use. And again, but we will touch upon specifically the dosage, stacking, etc., etc. You might have particular reasons for using the lower per mil, but in the 15 mil vial, which would require you to take more of an injection, but you might want to use less versus using the slightly higher dosed 100 milligram per milliliter in the 10 mil version. And it's not necessarily because it's going to be expensive relative to other testosterones. but you might want a slightly higher amount just to make it easy for you with regards to frequency of pinning. So yeah, those are your options, Steve. Anything else?
Yeah, and when it comes to which ones you should choose, keep in mind with the acetates, much shorter ester. And a lot of people, you know, I mean, you may like that. You may like the flexibility of that. You may like to run a shorter cycle. You want to run a
Yeah.
6 week and 8 week cycle, then you go with the acetate. It's got a shorter half life.
And again,
It's
Steve, as I said on other shows, especially if you're competing guys. So, for example, would I run it a long time? I could. It's relatively mild, but I want that flexibility if I'm competing. I want that flexibility if I'm using longer esters of other steroids and other testosterones at the beginning versus what I'd be using at the end. And especially, as I said before on other shows, when it comes to competing, male or female, on stage, you nearly always see the short resters at the end of a competition stack because you're manipulating the variables to bring that athlete, yourself, or as a client, coach, etc., that person to a peak of how their physique's going to look on the day of a competition. You can't do that if it's a long-acting ester and they still look fluffy or they still look like they're holding water. So it makes way more sense to be using a shorter acting version like the acetate at the end rather than at the beginning. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, and then the enanthate options are what's traditionally used. So with the enanthate, you definitely want to run it at least 10 weeks, 12 weeks, preferably. Some people will run it even longer. I've seen some guys go 16 or 20 weeks. Keep in mind, the longer you're on, the harder it's going to be to recover. So there are little disadvantages and advantages to each of these. The other disadvantage too, the primo acetate is only 50 milligrams a milliliter, and that could be a problem because that's going to require more injecting. Now, the nice thing about all these from EuroPharmas, and this is really good because the first time I used Primo, I used the Bear Primo, and the Bear Primo, Bayer, not bear as in the animal bear, but the Bear Primo, man, it was like injecting motor oil. I mean, you couldn't even draw the stuff out of the vial with a 23 gauge needle. That's how thick this stuff was. And you could not inject it with a 25 gauge needle. That's how thick it was. I'd have to use a 23 gauge needle just to inject this stuff and inject it slowly. It was absolutely nasty to inject this stuff. I hated it. And it only came in 100 milligram a milliliter like these, but the pain was so crazy. So you'd have to do like 2, 3 cc's at a time, and then you were in so much pain. Like I dropped to the floor in agony as soon as you injected it. The pain, it just felt like your muscle was getting squeezed. So EuroPharma, they do a really good job of lessening that post-injection pain to make it tolerable to inject it. You got to keep in mind, something like the Bear Primo back in the day, it was designed, if it was designed for medical purposes, for example, right?
Yes. Yes.
Obviously, it's not going to be designed for bodybuilding purposes, so it's not going to be designed to feel good or do high amount of volume.
And in lesser amounts, Steve. So half a mil of something that's fixed by a doctor versus us, as you said, on the lower dose product, we'd have to inject 2 milliliters a day just to get a decent dose. So the idea of a doctor giving you a half mil for a medical reason is a lot easier as an injection than us as performance enhancement requirement bodybuilders, athletes, etc., needing to of the lower dose product inject 2 mil a day every day. You absolutely want it different. Something I'll touch upon briefly, and I said we've seen this change. What happened when companies like Europharmacies first started to produce steroids they were exactly the same as the medical form. They were exactly the same. So again, a thicker oil, that's what works for the lab, that's what works for the medical treatment, and it made sense. Over time, they realized they did not have to use the same oils. Why? Why are we doing that? We're putting more of this product into the oil. Will it dissolve as well? And so on and so forth. So like Steve said, well, I've had it. Definitely. And I'm sure there's a bunch of listeners here that are nodding their heads going, yeah, definitely. It was so thick. It was murdered. And we have to use a big gauge needle to get it up. And if I use a small gauge needle, it took a minute, 2 minutes to inject versus seconds and so on. So what have we seen in the last few years, Steve? Pretty much every great lab, like EuroPharmacies, has gone over. It's almost, and I used this description before, like watchmakers oils. It's really, really thin. We're not seeing the stuff that if some users allergic reactions. We're not using the oils anymore, with 100 or 200 grand labs still being that kind of idiots. And that way, Steve, the thicker oils, the non-allergic oils, etc., etc. So pretty much most, not all, but pretty much most of them have switched over to grapeseed because it's the least allergic, it's the thinnest, it's the easiest. You still got great suspension in solution, and it's a lot easier to inject. In case, but there's certain things. If you, even, I mean, Steve, look, silly little thing. I've had vials of injectable steroids here, and you can shake the fluid in the vial and see how thick it is by how long it takes the oil to drain off the side, how viscous it is to drain off the side. And now it's just a lot thinner, a lot easier to use, very quickly coming down the side of the glass inside the vial, and so on and so forth. So it's a lot thinner in terms of the solution, which means it's a lot easier to inject. And if you don't want the thick stuff, you don't want that pain. I don't want to be sitting there for a minute and a half, 2 minutes, pushing the plunger down, Steve. Thank you very much. I want in, job, done, out. And of course, way less post-injection pain, much higher quality product, and are still able to do great suspension in solution, so you don't get the crystallization and so on and so forth. And that's exactly the sort of things that we're looking for with companies like EuroPharma when it comes to that. Back to you for a second, Steve.
All right, so let's move on how to use this stuff. And it's very important that we understand that there is a method to the madness of using any anabolic steroid. But with Primo, look, at the end of the day, you're going to need to run it at a strong dose to really get the most out of it. And you're going to have to run it for a period of time to get the most out of it. It's going to be a slow builder. It's gonna give you lean muscle mass. It's not gonna put on a bunch of water weight. You're not gonna put on a lot of fat on it. It's not gonna mess with your appetite like other steroids will. So it's one of those that you can really take your time, enjoy the journey. It's like having a good steak and just eating the steak slowly. That's what Primo is all about. So what you want to do with Primo, as a male, a dosage anywhere from 300 to 600 milligrams a week is what I recommend. And I also recommend you stack it. And there's a few reasons why you want to stack Primo. Now, the first one is by itself, it's just too weak. All right. You're not going to really get enough of a kick out of it. You're not going to have that androgenic kick to really push things with your workouts, push things with your strength, push things with your muscle building. And even if you don't care about strength, it's still important to get a little stronger on every cycle because that helps your muscles grow. Your muscles don't really have a stressor when you're not trying to push yourself a little bit. It's like, in other words, you can't go to the gym and curl 5-pound weights and expect to build muscle. I don't care if you do 50 repetitions. Okay. It's not going to put the stress on the muscle to grow, to be able to take advantage of these anabolic steroids in the first place. So it's a good idea to stack a little bit of an androgen with it. Now, another reason why we're going to get into what I'd recommend to stack with in a minute, but I'll give you a third reason why it's good to stack Primo, and that is it's a DHT derivative. So it's going to make the other steroids you use with it work even better because it's going to bind to sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG, when you're using it. So it's going to cause the free testosterone ratio to go up. So if you're using another steroid with it, it's really going to target that and make those other steroids work better. So it's going to make your cycle work even better when you're stacking it. You'll have much better results in a stack of Primo. Mobster, I'll touch on that and then we'll talk about what to stack with. Why don't you start us off with what you would stack it with?
Yeah, so as Steve said, I would probably use some sort of testosterone here, Steve. And in fact, arguably, an example that we've got would be Winstrol and Astanozole. It was actually occurring to me about two or three things. One were the options, as Steve said, with regards to the SHBG. I would probably put Provaron first, Masteron second, and Primo third in terms of the SHBG boost to free testosterone, in terms of the binder to SHBG. That would be that one. Number one is another thing I see sometimes, Steve, and this is where I would prefer a longer stack than a shorter stack. Occasionally we see guys out there that want to get into shape. They're using Primo, and it's the time scale. I don't think that I would use Primobolan and only run it for 4, 5, 6 weeks. I would want it to be an 8 to 12 week as a minimum for that. So it's not one of those ones you're going to get into shape real fast. Again, ideally, you're already kind of lean. So that's important to me as well. Me personally using it, and again, recommendation, again, me personally, no, purely simply because I'm not looking to get in shape for a holiday. I'm not looking to get in shape for the stage. So it's definitely not going to be something that I'm going to use as a strength enhancer or a bulker. Absolutely not. But I've got a buddy that this product was absolutely suit perfectly. So, for example, Primo for him, moderately dosed, again, 300 milligrams will be the lower end. I think you need to run it a little bit higher, especially if you want to see great results from it. But you've still got to put the work in, still got to be done like a motherfucker. But with this one, I wouldn't be, for example, using it with D-Bowl. So I might actually use it with another product like Anavar, Steve, purely and simply because he's going to maintain a muscle but keep that strength. And just as an example, let me expand on that because Steve mentioned something about it a minute or so ago. Okay, the idea, for example, that you could take a 5 or 10 pound dumbbell and maintain muscle tissue if you did 100 reps or even 500 reps. If that was the case, we'd all fucking do it, Steve. We absolutely would. There's always going to be a loss of strength and or muscle when you're dieting down to get into shape, but you want to retain as much of that muscle as possible. The only issue, Steve, is, and I think this would especially be the case if I was using it with Winstrol, is that you're going to get arguably so fucking dry that the risk factor for injuries goes up if you are still using crazy weights. So don't be afraid to work like an absolute motherfucker prior. And then for as long as the beginning of the cycle as possible, try to stay as strong as possible, and then drop off a little bit towards the end. Dosages, Steve. Again, it depends, but I would go from anywhere between 50 milligrams per day to 100 milligrams per day, maybe running something else with it, pushing the whole total still up to around 1,000 milligrams total. My preference personally would always be slightly less. And again, Steve, 8 to 12 weeks, maybe 16 weeks. What about the dosages on the Winstrol? You're looking at maybe 50 milligrams every day with that, Steve. And in fact, the 100 milligrams of Primo and the 50 milligrams of Winstrol takes you just a fraction over the number I've just suggested. So 1,050 milligrams per week. So just over a gram, which I think is absolutely perfect. What else would I use in there, Steve? What other options would you run with? So let's keep it, for example, 600, 700 milligrams a week on the Primo. What steroid would you add to it? And give your reasons why.
So in the Arnold stack, it was said that he would stack in some Dianabol, a handful of Dianabol with it per day. So he would do like 20 to 40 milligrams of Dianabol with the Primo. And the Dianabol will give the cycle a nice kick, give him some estrogenic effects, give him some androgenic effects. So it's a nice balance. So today we can kind of translate that into testosterone. And we could say you can either do the Dianabol Arnold idea, or you can do a testosterone idea. So EuroPharmacies has you covered with Dianabol and with testosterone. So with testosterone, you can hit, anywhere from 100 milligrams up to as much as you want, just depending on how you like testosterone, what you're trying to do out of the cycle. If you're looking for just pure lean muscle mass, you're looking to recomp, you're looking to cut, keep the testosterone dose low. But if you're looking to do more of a moderate bulk, lean bulk type of cycle, then you can go with your testosterone a little higher. Again, everybody's different. Some of you out there are going to cut really good on testosterone. I would say maybe 15 or 20% of you out there, you can actually run a moderate amount of testosterone in any situation and you'll experience cutting effects. Everybody's going to be different, but most of you are going to not have that happen. Most of you will not cut well on high amounts of testosterone. There's a reason competitors, they'll cut their testosterone off before a show because they don't want the water retention. They don't want the fluffiness, you see. So, but it just depends. But for most of you, anywhere from 100 up to 500 milligrams of testosterone with the Primo would be a good stack and give it a nice little kick.
I think we also have the advantage in this day and age, Steve, which Arnold and the others did not. Of course, we do have access to AI, so we can control the estrogen, we can control that fluffiness, and we can obviously be aware of the water that you might get, for example, with running testosterone. Something that me and Steve have agreed on and mentioned in multiple shows is the idea, for example, with certain PEDs, you've got to run the test higher, you've got to run the test lower. No, you've just got to see how your body refers to. And of course, EuroPharma has a bunch of, and ancillary medications you can get to in terms of letrozole, Arimidex, etc. So they've got all of that covered for you. Again, none of the things that Arnold, etc., would have had access to back in the day. So absolutely. My recommendation, Steve, for any Primo Focus cycle, and I'm saying Primo Focus because it doesn't have to be the main drug, it doesn't have to be the main PED, but let's assume that it is, would be that you get into what I would call relatively good shape, or in order to see the best from it, be kind of lean to begin with. I wouldn't want to be out of shape and then using Primo. I want to be in shape and then get into amazing shape using Primo. So that's my thought process there. And again, for example, Steve, using GW along with that to enable your cardio to be good, to give you the energy, especially while you're cutting, especially while you're on low carbs, the calorific intake has decreased, etc. Absolutely makes sense to me in that particular way as well. So yeah, any more thoughts on that, Steve, before we move on?
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, try it out. If you've never tried Primo, give the EuroPharma Primo a shot. And as we get into the next segment, why Europharmacies is so popular, one of the reasons they're so popular is when you order from them, you know what you're getting. So the Primo is what you're getting. So touch on that, Mobster.
Yeah, so like I said before, Steve, back in the day, we know, and what Steve and I have both discussed is how often it was faked. So you had the original, being able to get product like this from the doctors, as Arnold did, go and see your friendly doctor. You knew it was pharmaceutical. You knew it came from the company. You knew it was the same product was being medical use. When companies, UGLs, whatever you want to call them, started to produce it, you get an original product that's probably great. And then eventually over time, as the raws are so goddamn expensive, our profit margins are so tiny, so they get lazy and they either cut the product, meaning it's less dosage per milligram than it says on the label, or it's not even Primobolan full stop. We've even heard of obviously certain steroid medications where there was no steroid anything. It was just literally the oil or maybe some sort of inert filler type powder with no sort of steroidal mix whatsoever in the product. Lo and behold, over time, and I'm including neuropharmacists with this, you do not get to last 15, 20, 30 years in the business if you was or had some sort of reputation for constantly cutting your Primo, for constantly producing underdosed products, for literally producing fakes, because you would get caught out. The only way a lab is going to get around that is they're going to have to go off and rename themselves, restart the business, come out in a different particular way, maybe produce different kind of label products, etc. So that happens. We know that that's happened. But you can go off, and again, this is one of those things where I would encourage the listener to go off and do their own research. I believe EuroPharmacies are coming up on the 30-year mark. Certainly 20, 21, 22 years at least. It might be close to 30 years. I'm kind of sure that it is. And you do not get to last 30 years in the business if you're faking stuff. You would be caught out. The independent testing will catch you out. So first, let's number one, how long has the lab been in business? And EuroPharmacy is right up there. That's number one. Number two is you can buy direct or you can go off and look at the resellers. And why are the resellers selling your brand? Why are your resellers selling EuroPharmacies? For the same reasons. They trust this company's product. They don't want to be dealing with issues of having products come back. They don't want to be dealing with issues where people say it's a fake product or complaints. They don't want people doing independent testing and find that the products are underdosed. So that's that. That's the reason why resellers sell EuroPharmacies. So that's that. Moving on, you have, and we've seen this on our own family of forums, but I've seen it elsewhere as well, Steve. And I got asked to be part of one back in the day. I just remembered. So let me just use the British one, the story I'm about to tell. 10, 12 individuals, I think this has happened a couple of times in America as well, Steve, putting $100 or $200 into the pot and then saying, listen, we've got a bunch of sources on our particular forum, as was, and the idea was that we would pick at random amongst the group which brands are we going to use? Okay, so it'd be one brand 1 month, one brand the next month, and so on and so forth. And they would buy 1, 2, 3 different vials of whatever those brands were producing, and all 3, 4 vials would be sent off to a lab for testing, and that would be $200-300. UK say £200 to have these products tested, whether it was via trading standards or where it was a properly accredited laboratory that specifically worked to test for different kinds of steroids, so they can identify what's in the product. So more recently, we've seen exactly the same, and I'm thinking of one particular individual who brought 10 different products from a bunch of our approved sources that we talk about on these forums, on this podcast, and he sent all 10 products of his own pocket, so that each one came from a different reseller or from a different brand, from a different approved source. Every single one of these 10 products was sent off, again, at his own cost to a lab. Please let me know the results. So he said, he put the results, literally every single lab result, every single test certificate was posted for us to see. And he literally introduced this with I thought 2 of these products were foul. He said, I had a good feeling about most of these labs, most of these sources, but I couldn't understand, I couldn't get my head around the idea that all 10 companies, all 10 products would pass. Every single one passed. And this included a EuroPharmacist product. I think there was actually 2 EuroPharmacist products in that lineup. Every single one passed. They all passed. This is great. And Steve actually mentioned the percentage earlier, by a higher percentage than the pharmaceutical industry allows for. So if I buy 200 milligrams of ibuprofen, an anti-inflammatory, it should contain 200 milligrams, but the actual legal lawful amount, I believe, Steve, is around 90 to 95%. So it doesn't have to be, it could be 180 milligrams, it could be 190 milligrams, which will be 80 or 90%. So you go, sorry, 90 or 95%. So every single product came in between 97, 98 or 99%. In other words, better than that allowed for by the pharmaceutical industry in terms of legal restrictions, etc., etc. So pretty much that means every single product passed, including EuroPharmacist, and all of them was above the legally, lawfully available set percentage for those products. So that was absolutely amazing. Then we could talk about, as we said earlier on, the oils, the quality, the labels, the wanting batch numbers, product testing, holograms, all the stuff that low-level labs, low-quality products, low sources that we've never heard of don't do, or worse, Steve, we do get, as you know, on the forums, we get to be asked about certain sources, and you go, no, look, they've got maybe one good product, 9 of their products are shit. How many times we've seen stuff of their products come back underdosed, all these kind of things. Now, in terms of actual use, and this is me personally, and I've said this multiple times, I literally had a touchdown yesterday, Steve. Nothing to do with the supplier. Fucking post office was horrendously bad this last delivery, so it took way too long to get here. But they are my go-to. They are my staple. They literally are sort of the foundation of any stack that I put together is EuroPharmacist products from one of their resellers. And for me, it's like, well, I know what works for me is this, this, and this. And I know, for example, I trust and love their Anavar, the D-Bowl. I've just literally started TRT last week. So I'm using one of their product, Testcipionate, right now. And if you come and see on the logs, you will see as that product having an effect on me. You've seen me run bulk stack back in the day, Steve, when I got to my all-time highest body weight using their stuff in their Deca. So for me, they're absolutely a trusted source. I know that you've used them as well, Steve. So what do you think about their products?
Oh, I could tell you their top 3. Not even about me using them. Their top 3 most used brand out there, and top 3 most popular. And I trust them. If a customer comes to me, a client comes to me, and I'm giving them a consultation, which you guys can always get a hold of me. Come on the forum if you're looking for a consultation. But one of the top 5 brands that I always recommend is EuroPharmacies. And ultimately, it's your decision on who you buy. It's not my business. It's your money. And, whatever you want to do is your decision. But for me, I'm going to do my best to point you in the right direction because I want you to be using legitimate gear. I've been there. I've used bad gear over the years. So
Yeah.
I don't want the same thing to happen to you guys. You guys work hard for your money. Mobster and I work hard. Mobster is semi-retired now, but he used to work really hard. I mean, he's a working man.
Blue collar man back in the day. Very little white collar work in my time.
I mean, he's one of those guys, he's a tough guy,
I'm a motherfucker for the money, guys. So listen, right? The way that it works for me is if the majority of our listeners here will have some kind of education, but they're still grafting, Steve. So it's important to them that they get value for money. It's important to them, especially when it comes to putting a drug into your body, and especially when it comes to what we call performance enhancement drugs, and that includes steroids, that you trust the company that the prices are reasonable, that the product does exactly what it's supposed to do. And as I've said, especially when it comes to the hard work, and I say this all the time, if you work your fucking ass off in the gym, if you are really good when it comes to the diet, you want the performance enhancement drugs that you're using to be that part of that process. And so that's why we both know, and that's why Steve recommends them, as why I personally use them and recommend them myself. I've used their products. I've had fantastic fucking results from their products. The prices are certainly very reasonable, to say the least. And something I've touched upon as well, Steve, is that literally they're the company that's gone pretty much of all the sources that we talk about, from the 10 mil to the 15 mil vials. So they're being innovative. They've asked the users of their products, what do you want to see, both in terms of the products that they produce and other innovations, whether it's triple layer labels on their vials that you peel off and see more information underneath rather than a single layer, whether it's more sophisticated tracking, batch numbers, checkability, whether they have great testing and so on and so forth. So listen, guys, when it comes to Primobolan, when it comes to getting into shape, we want to recommend for you great sources, and we want to make sure that you're getting proper use with sensible dosages of the products like Primobolan that's going to enable you to get into shape. So whether that's telling you to be lean to when you start with, work your ass off for the gym, posting logs on the forum. And again, why are we seeing a rise in Primobolan? Why are we seeing a rise in users who are getting great results? Because they understand that the quality muscle on their physiques is the kind of physique and gains, etc., and the results that they're looking for. And using a company like EuroPharma is going to help them do that, Steve. So yeah, please note, we're not doctors and the opinions are ours. It is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.